Is this the black gold for our green future, and should we be mining them from the seabed? Hello and welcome to the show. Shortly I'll be looking at the increasingly urgent debate about whether we should be dredging these nodules full of useful minerals up from the sea floor. Also on the programme, birds of prey are a British conservation success story, and I've been out with the RSPB's investigations unit to learn about the threats they face. And as the government doubles down on drilling for new oil and gas, we fact-check some of the arguments it's making and hear what climate-vulnerable states think about Britain's political pivot.
We are disappointed because we see the UK as one of our leading partners in the issue of climate change.
This lump of black stuff is not coal. It's what's called a polymetallic nodule, and it's full of metals like nickel, which are essential to our green tech transition. And what if I told you there was part of our planet where these are just lying around in their trillions? The problem is that that place is what's called the Abyssal Plane, thousands of meters beneath the surface of the sea. Yet some companies think they can and should be mining these and have been doing exploration down there. There's just been a meeting in Jamaica, an international meeting of countries debating whether this should be allowed to go ahead and what the rules of the game would be. And more than 20 countries said we should have a moratorium on it. Well, one of the companies that wants to start mining these is the metals company, hoping maybe to begin extraction as early as 2025. And their CEO, Gerard Barron, joins me. Gerard, what is in this?
Well, this is a polymetallic nodule and it's full of nickel, copper, cobalt and manganese. And they're the metals that we're going to need billions of tons more of as we decarbonize and move away from fossil fuels.
And tell me about how these occur actually on the seabed and how you get them up.
Well, they're unique because they precipitate the metals that are in the seawater or the sediment. So think of them, they grow like a pearl, and they're located in the abyssal zone, which is about half of our planet is categorized as abyssal. It's about 4,000 meters below sea level.
So are these literally kind of scattered around and what it kind of rakes them as it goes sort of thing?
Well, think of it as a golf driving range that has not much grass, it's just golf balls. And what our robot does is fire a jet of water at them. It's an engineering principle known as the Coanda effect. So we fire a jet of water at them, and as the collector head changes direction, it lifts them, so we don't go down and scour the seafloor.
I think you would acknowledge that the Abyssal Plane, as you call it, is one of the kind of untouched, unexploited parts of our planet. Should we really be putting mineral extraction in somewhere like that?
I think it's exactly where we should be having mineral extraction because, as I mentioned, about 50% of the planet is categorized as the abyssal zone. And there's a really simple principle, I believe, that we should be guided by, and that is that we should be carrying out extractive industries in parts of the planet where there is the least life, where there is no alternative use, as opposed to parts of the planet where there is the most life and where people are living.
And where are we getting most of these minerals from at the moment that you say is worse?
Well, rainforest nickel, and I encourage your viewers to Google rainforest nickel, and unfortunately it all sits underneath the rainforest. So to get to it, you've got to remove the rainforest. You've also got to push out all of the indigenous communities. You've got to destroy the carbon sinks and the biodiversity that lives amongst it. And then of course you've got to process it, and much of the fallout from that ends up in our oceans and rivers anyway.
But where you're getting this from is an untouched ecosystem. Those are very, very rare on the planet. Surely we should be leaving them alone.
I think there's a reason why there is a high abundance of these nodules in this area. It's 1,000 miles off the coast of Mexico. It's in the Pacific Ocean, and they happen to have all the metals that we need to move away from fossil fuels. Put the pieces together, and there's no alternative use for it. And we can mitigate the impacts of picking them up.
Whether or not you believe it's kind of relatively environmentally benign. You've got a big problem. A lot of countries, a lot of big companies, many of which are involved in making batteries, are saying they're not going to use this stuff. They're going to boycott your product. That's a problem.
Well, they're not going to use it until there is more scientific evidence, which of course we've been investing heavily in, and they're not going to use it until the regulations are in place. Now, when you say a lot of countries, it's around 10% of the member countries of the regulator that will regulate us. And those countries aren't saying no, they're just saying put the regulations in place before
They're calling
you start.
for a moratorium, aren't they?
Until the regulations are in place or until there is more scientific evidence. And both of those issues are coming to a fast conclusion.
I mean, it is quite sci-fi, and if this were a film, you know, I'm sorry to say, you'll probably be the bad guy in this. You'll be the one that's exploiting it, because there is this sort of gut feeling that we are exploiting something that we should be leaving alone. Do you kind of understand that?
I think it depends if you're a glass half full or a glass half empty person. Personally, I'm a glass half full, and I think this is the solution to the climate crisis.
Thanks very much, Gerald. Really fascinating. Well, earlier I spoke to Louisa Casson from Greenpeace, someone I expect you've come across, and asked her why they're so opposed, given that reaching net zero will create huge demand for these minerals.
Well, if we really needed deep sea mining, then why would we have major car companies, battery companies, even the International Renewable Energy Agency saying we should be very cautious, that they don't want anything to do with deep sea mining because of the environmental risk?
What do you think the actual harms will be to the wildlife and the habitat of the seabed?
We already know that deep sea mining would cause irreversible and unavoidable harm to deep sea ecosystems. You know, we're talking about giant bulldozers removing parts of the habitat.
Not actually bulldozers.
Kind of, you know, huge tank-like machines that, you know,
Right.
do resemble bulldozers when we look at the machines that have already been built to scale. You know, and they are removing, whether the nodules, whether we're talking about deep sea vents, removing parts of the habitat that deep sea life relies on. You know, you have octopuses that are laying eggs on the sponges that can be found on these nodules. We're talking about whipping up clouds of sediment and potentially pollution that could clog or suffocate different deep sea creatures. But I think also when we're talking about noise and light in a habitat that hasn't had any human interference, that could also have a really disturbing impact, not just on the deep sea floor, but also further throughout the water column. So there is a real risk that the noise could interfere with whales and dolphins and their communications as well.
But we need nickel, we need cobalt, we need lithium, we need things like this. At the moment, these are extracted with often quite a lot of damage. I mean, there is damage to minerals extraction, isn't there?
Absolutely,
And we
mining
need
has caused
those
huge
minerals.
harm, yeah, but the lesson that we should learn from the damage of mining on land is not to expand the damage from mining by extending that into the ocean floor.
Expand the damage on land then?
Well, no, what we would do if we don't have deep sea mining is actually there's a real incentive to be reusing and recycling metals, and we can already
We just
see...
don't have enough. With the growth of the renewable energy and batteries, we don't have enough currently. We need to extract more. Surely you'd acknowledge that.
Well, I think, you know, we know that the existing sources on land, we need to look at those very, very carefully. And also we know that we can significantly reduce those projected demands if we are very, very careful and we don't expand into these new frontiers.
Still slightly unclear. For our minerals future, would you rather we expanded the extraction on land or went to the sea?
Well, I think we absolutely need to say no to the deep sea, and we need to be very careful about looking at on land. We need to have all the options on the table and make sure that when we know that something is going to cause huge harm, like in the deep sea, that we're saying no to that, and we're actually able to look at what we've got on land, to be looking at how we do that responsibly, but how that has to go hand in hand with massively scaling up, reusing and recycling. There are so few ecosystems that are untouched by human and industrial impacts. And so that's why we know that to stop and to reverse biodiversity loss, we need to keep these ecosystems intact. Of course, we need to be looking at restoration on land for ecosystems that have already been damaged. But if we're really serious about tackling the nature crisis, we can't be expanding into areas which are relatively intact. The deep sea is an incredibly important carbon store. It's a haven of wildlife. We're discovering new species with practically every expedition that goes down there. I think the real risk is the untold damage because there is still so much that we're learning about the deep sea.
Thanks very much indeed, Louisa. Well, we're going to move from the sea to the air now. And it wasn't long ago that birds of prey were an incredibly rare sight, especially in the south of England. But now I can often even see a red kite here above Sky's offices in West London. But with this success comes some pressure and some persecution. and I've been out with the RSPB to find out more. The chance of seeing Britain's largest bird of prey swooping across the skies is rare. The white-tailed eagle was persecuted to extinction in England 240 years ago. Recovery has come from reintroductions and now successful breeding. But some gamekeepers and shepherds oppose their return. It's a lovely meadow, this, isn't it? I mean, I guess this is the sort of place where birds of prey would find their little voles and rodents and things in the grass.
Yeah, you know, you'd often see young buzzards sitting around looking for young rabbits, I guess. You know, that's the main.
As their numbers have increased, so have crimes against them. And that's why the RSPB has an investigations unit dedicated to prosecuting those who harm raptors.
So we are still seeing shooting, trapping, poisoning. During the lockdown years, there was record numbers of crimes against birds of prey, 141 in 2020, which is the highest ever figure. It's typically in association with game bird estates. So 71% of all crimes in 2021 happened on land used for game bird shooting.
And what's their motive?
Well, they would argue it's to protect game bird stocks, to make birds the maximum number of game birds available to be shot.
Despite it being illegal to kill birds of prey, cases can be hard to prosecute. So Mark and his team set up covert operations to catch perpetrators in the act.
Some of the cases we're involved, you know, they're horrific, where we've filmed a buzzard in a trap and somebody comes along, the gamekeeper comes along and beats it to death with a piece of wood. You know, these are crimes which do not belong in modern society.
Most of the shooting community would agree, but say there are times when raptors kill so many game birds that they need to be controlled, and that can include permission to kill an individual.
Managed doesn't necessarily mean lethal control. There could be a need to control one bird from a population that's doing very, very well.
And that is a license to kill, in effect, is it?
No, it doesn't have to be for killing.
But
So,
can
for
it be?
instance, Yes, of course it could be. So in certain situations, you could get a license to prevent birds nesting in a particular area. So it's about using the right method at the right time, and most of the time the methods will be deterrence and habitat management.
Despite the threats that birds of prey face, one species has really exploded since its reintroduction in 2003. Not so long ago, you could only find red kites in pockets of Wales. Now their numbers have increased by 1,000%. This hill in Oxfordshire is a great place to watch birds of prey. There have been a couple of kestrels hunting in the grass down here, looking for voles and other rodents. And over there, I've had my eye on a red kite that's been enjoying a free ride as the wind comes up the slope and gives it lift. It's just stunning. The Earth Trust charity ensures spaces like this are managed for nature to thrive and people to enjoy.
Red kites are scavengers and they're also predators, so they need big open spaces to fly around for hunting. And they also need this kind of long grass, which is really good for small mammals, earthworms and invertebrates.
But it hasn't stopped them appearing in people's gardens and stealing the odd sandwich. Some people think there are too many, Jane. We see headlines saying, you know, flying rats, all of that sort of thing. What is the relationship with people?
Where there tends to be conflict is where there might be a community that's feeding them and enhancing the population in certain locations.
But can too many red kites be a bad thing?
There is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that you know, kites in big densities are actually pushing other birds out as well, and especially, you know, sort of songbirds and stuff are kind of being outcompeted.
Raptors in numbers are a formidable air power, and conservationists are now beginning to see some collateral damage. But surely that's outweighed for now by such a great natural spectacle. We're going to a break now. When we come back, we'll be playing Chaps Says, a fact check of how the Net Zero Secretary is selling the government's policy on new oil and gas. Welcome back to the show. Now, it's been another controversial week in UK climate policy, with Rishi Sunak announcing his intention to issue 100 new licences for oil and gas in the North Sea. Greenpeace activists scaled the Prime Minister's house and draped it in oily black fabric to protest on Thursday. And a group of self-declared angry mums also took to Downing Street to protest.
He's playing with our kids' futures, he's playing with all of our future, and it's egotistical, and quite frankly, we're all just completely furious.
Energy and Net Zero Secretary Grant Chaps was on Sky News earlier in the week trying to sell the plan.
It would be a mad policy not to grant these oil and gas licenses. We're doing it because it gives us energy security, British energy made here in the UK, and because it actually decreases, not increases, the amount of carbon.
Energy security, lower emissions and a stronger economy all sound like compelling reasons, but what's the truth here? Let's look at some of the points that the Energy Secretary has been making online this week. Grant Shapps says that producing our own oil and gas means we can't be blackmailed by the likes of Vladimir Putin. But unlike much of Europe, the UK only ever got about 4% of its gas from Russia. That's now at 0%, with the majority coming from not very hostile Norway. Mr Shapps also says producing gas in the UK results in just a quarter of the carbon emissions of imports. The UK is importing more liquefied natural gas from places like Qatar and the US since Russia invaded Ukraine, and that does have about 4 times the carbon intensity in the production stage. But most of the UK's imports come from Norway via pipeline, and that is actually less emissions intensive than UK gas. All the while, of course, the majority of gas's carbon footprint is from burning it, which is identical whatever the source. And while the political calculation might be that such statements and policies play well with part of the electorate here, climate change is of course an international issue, and some of the world's most vulnerable states have been paying attention. And I'm joined now by Powell Lutero, who is ambassador from Samoa to the United Nations and also chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. Powell, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We've seen what looks like a little bit of a step back from some of the sort of climate ambitions of the UK. What do you make of things like that?
Well, we are disappointed. I think it's fair to say that we are disappointed because we see the UK as one of our leading partners in the issue of climate change. We do look to the big countries, the industrialized countries like the UK, to take a leadership role.
One of the things that particularly happened this week was the UK government granted new oil and gas licenses for drilling, for exploration, I should say, in the North Sea, probably over 100 of them. What do you think about that?
Let's perhaps phrase that in the context of the 1.5 degree target that we have set. And I don't think that, getting involved in more exploration for fossil fuel is going to solve the problem. I think we know the science on that. But, I think we hope that the UK will relook at the situation and perhaps, come to their better judgment.
They say it is compatible with 1.5 degrees and indeed with our own net zero goals for 2050. What do you think?
Well, I mean, that assessment, I hope, is correct, because according to the latest IPCC report, we're dangerously close to the 1.5, and we might even go over that, but it's still within reach. So I'm not quite sure. We're listening to the science. I'm not privy to the information on where it's coming in terms of the determination by the UK government.
I noticed that you actually have 1.5 as a badge on your jacket. For you in Samoa and the people of the small island states, this is more than just a number, I take it. This is almost kind of life and death for the country, is it?
It is. It is our survival. And we have said this so many times, small island developing states, that the 1.5, we cannot go over 1.5. Otherwise, our very survival is at risk.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Now, the Prize for Humanity is an award given to people who've done a lot to fight climate change or maybe halt nature loss. Greta Thunberg is a previous winner. And we caught up with one of this year's 3 winners, Cécile Vivienne Jabet from Cameroon, who's been fighting to protect forests and wetlands.
I'm Cécile Vivienne Jabet. I'm an activist for women's rights and gender equality, but by profession, I'm a social forester. Women play a key role in combating climate change, trying to restore African forests that are destroyed by unsustainable practices. We are in a patriarchal system where everything is dominated by men. So we brought women into restoring our degraded land. We are in a very good enabling environment because our government have committed in restoring millions of hectares of degraded land. So we are coming in as implementers. For that, we need at least to be allocated those degraded areas. Unless we have security to the tenure of those areas, it will become useless. But I visited one group early this year. Those women were so happy to share with me that they are getting the fish back. We have never got this quantity of fish for the past 10 years because we have replanted our mangroves, we have the mangroves back, and we are having our fish back. You see, these are actions this prize will be continue to do it with those women. We believe in them.
Well, that is almost the end of the show. Next week, I'm going to be here talking about the inadequate protection of the wildlife of our seas. But just before we go, I want to leave you with these pictures of some of the 3 new baby beavers born in Somerset at a reintroduction project in Exmoor, run by the National Trust. The charity says their births show the success of conservation projects in improving the landscape for nature. And here you can make out Dad teaching one of the babies, known as Kits, the ropes. Remember, you can catch up on all your climate and environment news on the Sky News website and app, or by scanning the QR code that is on your screen right now. Bye.